Let's start off with something that I have shown you before. Now this, regrettably, this genographic DNA test is a little bit old, and if they have better methods of DNA now, and I tempted, my wife just spent less than a year ago, spent $70-some to do a DNA test when they were on sale. But anyway, this shows, all right, it's Chinese starting out right here, ending up right here, might have come from around here, around Canaan and Egypt. Something I did not mention in the first class this morning, but Ham had a son named Ham had a son named Canaan. That's Noah's son. He had a son named, from whom came the Sinites. The Sinites is the same as China. China used to be called Sinan. The Chinese are today the most numerous people on the face of the earth. And
The most what on here?
getting more. What's that?
The most what on here?
The most numerous, the most widespread. Now, the Chinese were the people whom I look on as that having almost invented the airplane, almost invented the radio, the television, the computer, the spaceship, but they didn't. The inventions that they did make, though, should have propelled them to the top of the world. They should have overspread the whole globe. In fact, I'll even go so far as to say they should have conquered the whole world. But they got so far into development and they stopped. What did they invent that was so great? Well, several things. The most important one perhaps was the printing press. You may not realize, folks, but without the printing press, you cannot have airplanes, or you can't even have novels. You can't have textbooks for high schools and colleges without the printing press. You just simply can't spread the knowledge you have all over. But they invented the printing press, they invented gunpowder, they invented the movable sail. Now you may or may not know that in a sailboat you can sail against the wind by zigzag. Like if the wind is blowing this way and you want to go this way, you zig and you zag, and every time you zig and zag, you change the position of the sails a little bit. You can catch the wind. They invented the rudder. Without rudders, you can't have airplanes, much less ships. Fore and aft rigging, two different types of rigs, fore and aft rigging. What else? Well, yeah, they invented silk, porcelains, steel. Without steel, you cannot have big structures like super big bridges or super tall skyscrapers. Folks, well, without steel, there's a limit to how big your battleships can be. Their inventions should have put them on the top of the world. The wheelbarrow, among other things. And very important, they invented banking, paper money. You may or may not yet realize, without banks, most of you will never have an automobile. Without lending institutions of the sort, whether it be banks or credit unions or lending institutions, without those, you'll probably never, most of you would never own a home, never own a house, never own property. Thanks to banks, you have a chance to get all these things. The Chinese had banking. Now, to give you an example of what went wrong, it wasn't their emperors, even though a lot of persons have accused their emperors, it was their philosophers. Their philosophers told them that banking led to greed. And the emperors closed the banks down. Okay? We don't want a greedy bunch of folk here. The Chinese invented paper money. Without paper money, you cannot have a complex economy. Now, for instance, I spent 27 years working in an airplane factory, Lockheed Martin. And what if Lockheed paid its workers, had paid it in gold and silver coins? The result would have been chaos. I mean, we'd all try to carry out a whole bushel basket full of gold and silver coins every week. Well, maybe that's exaggerated, but there's just not enough gold and silver to go around. Lockheed didn't even really pay us in paper money. They paid us mostly by bank transfer, at least during the time I was there. Now, at one time, they wrote out checks. Again, they had to have a bank. And you might ask, well, now, Lockheed's a prime example, because Lockheed would go for months at a time without selling an airplane. Well, how'd they pay their workers? Answer is credit. Well, what if they could only have paid us when they sold planes? We might go 5 or 6 months working without getting any money. Then all of a sudden they dump tens of thousands of dollars on each one of us. Well, the result would have been starvation, chaos, deep indebtedness, and all that stuff. But again, thanks to banking, they made a smooth transaction. Again, the Chinese had this and quit. Chinese philosophers told that paper money leads to greed. And of course, we can't have greed around. So the emperors stopped coining paper money. As far as their ships that had the rudders, by the way, the Chinese got to California several years before Columbus came to the other side of the world. The Chinese found California to be a nice, fertile place, but they never bothered to go back. There are persons who believe the Chinese went around the world, but they and mapped the whole world, but they quit after a while. They got so far and stopped. Now, why they stopped, that's an issue that we'll be going into throughout the semester. But anyway, these were the people who almost did and didn't. Another reason, just besides the DNA studies that lead me to believe that the Chinese might have started out in Africa, is that the Chinese and Africans have a few things in common. Number one, they both had a fascination for the afterlife. The Egyptian pharaohs would bury themselves in mummies to preserve their body, and oftentimes bury their wealth with them. And know their wealth was not put in pyramids, but in their tombs. So, they had a fascination for the afterlife. Now, as one Chinese emperor buried himself with 6,000 terracotta figures. These terracotta figures at one point found their way to the Civic Center here in Atlanta. I did not go see them. To me, I try to avoid downtown Atlanta as much as possible. Crowded, and I don't know that, of course, if I look like a country the way I am, but that's something else. Anyway, but I try to avoid the downtown area. But anyway, he buried himself 6,000. The reason was he believed that these figures, no two of which are alike, and these figures might have represented his servants, his generals, his ambassadors, and whatever. But it's apparently he believed that these people would go with him in the next life. Now, at least he didn't do like some rulers have done. Some rulers are known to have killed all their servants or had their servants killed when they died. That way their servants would go with them into the afterlife and be their servants still in the afterlife. Be that, but also the idea of killing your servants when you die, one purpose of that is to give your servants incentive to keep you alive, as if you could somehow live forever. I know a book that says that when you die, the servant is free from his master. Yes.
I wanted to ask, the people who killed all the servants, like, who would they be?
I've heard, I can't name them. I've heard that some rulers did, but as far as being specific and specifically naming them, I can't. I do know that in India, there's a practice called jetty. The wives were killed when their husbands died by throwing themselves on a flame of fire. This we will talk about in the book. This practice went on for centuries, many a century. And keep in mind, folks, a lot of the men would marry 9-year-old girls. So guess who was likely to die first? We'll get to that in a little bit. But anyway, they had a fascinating afterlife. Also, the Chinese and the Egyptians wrote their history according to their dynasties. However, in the case of the Egyptians, they numbered their dynasties, first dynasty, second dynasty, and so on. Lack of creativity, you might say. The Chinese had names for their dynasties. Some of the more famous being the Qin and the Han. There were others. Later on, we'll talk about the Song dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Song, the Yuan dynasty, and some others. But they had names for their dynasties. Some of their dynasties, one of them lasted some 900 years. Another dynasty lasted 400 years. And one dynasty I will mention later today only lasted about 18 or so years. It consisted of one man. The Qin, Han, anyway, their history revolved around their dynasties. And also, Chinese writing, to me, now maybe to no one else, resembles Egyptian hieroglyphics. But again, if I were a Chinese expert, I might not think so. Or if I were an expert in hieroglyphics, I might not think so. But to me, the two types of writing look alike. Anyway, personally, I think, and I have this little bit of data to back it up, the Chinese did start out in Africa. I guess one reason I'm emphasizing it, I asked that question on a test one time. Only one person got it right, and I think that was a guess because I had failed to mention it in class, and it's not in the book. So don't anyone say that I failed to mention it in the test. All right, leaving that. Oh yes, another thing that the Chinese invented was shoulder harness. What's that? That's for horses. But the other peoples of the world, when they had a horse pull a cart or pull a plow, they would attach the harness to the horse's neck and expect the horse to pull the plow with the harness attached. The Chinese moved the harness on down to the horse's shoulders, and the horse was able to pull a whole lot more weight. Now, if horses could see humans being strapped to a shoulder harness, the horses would have the last laugh. All right, leaving that. Anyway, like other civilizations, the Chinese started on the banks of rivers. Their two rivers were the Yellow and Yangtze. Interestingly enough, within a few miles of here, there's a river called the Yellow River, but nothing compared to China's. Our Yellow River over here is not much more than a creek, if any of you have ever seen it. If you head for Athens, you might see a sign that's when you cross over a small bridge, Yellow River. Anyway, but the Chinese at one point built a canal to join the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. This canal is still in operation and still in service, even though the railroad has done a lot to undermine the effectiveness of canals. Canals have a bad habit of freezing up in wintertime, and also when you have a heavy rain, they'll silt up and you have to remove the silt. The Chinese removed the silt from their canal by getting teams of men. The ones in the front row would pass the mud to the person behind them, who in turn passed the mud to them until the mud got to the top of the hill. Then the last row would simply throw the mud over the top of the hill. And this was their way. It took a lot of manpower, but it did get the mud out of the canal. Chinese homes in olden times were very simple, sparsely furnished, a lot of times nothing more than one room with maybe a bed that doubled up as a sofa and tables that might even double up as benches or chairs. Some of the, if you were well off, enough off, you might have 2 rooms, but very simple. Their families were what we call extended families. You were considered part of the same family. You have the same great-great-grandpa. In other words, they counted from the male side. In other words, if you, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, if you were descended from the same great-great-grandfather on the male side as someone else, you were considered part of the same family. This extended family that was necessary because their main crop eventually became rice, and still is. Rice takes teams of people to grow. It calls for digging, you might say almost digging canals, and then planting the rice underwater, and the rice paddies grow from underwater, and you have to work the rice while it's still underwater, so you have to work by wading in, and you run the risk of getting leeches biting on you, whatever else. But nevertheless, the Chinese have grown rice for generations and grown it well, grown lots of it. While on the sort of subject of farming, I want to introduce you to a word that seems like few of you have heard. Arable. A-R-A-B-L-E. This describes land that is good for farming. Now, in the case of China, China might look like a big country, but much of its land is not arable. Now, in other words, most of China's people live right along here in China proper, or less so in Manchuria, this region here. But this whole area here, Inner Mongolia and Tibet, these areas are the land, most of the land is not arable, very, very poor farmland. When I was a kid and reading space books, Tibet was the area of the world they said was most like Mars. Very thin air, very high in altitude, high in elevation that is. Today, though, they're saying that these islands here in North Canada, because they're cold temperatures, are the most like Mars. Life in Tibet was hard at best. Tibet is also known as a land of magic, which we'll talk about later. And for years, I'd see a professor come here with a sign, Free Tibet. At times, Tibet has gotten its independence from China, and at times have been conquered. Under the communists, they were conquered, and they remain conquered to this day. I do not think the Chinese are about to get rid of them. Also, in the case of farming, the Chinese learned very early, you might call it crop rotation, but they would let land lie fallow. Now, fallow means you let it sit there for a year and grow nothing. Crop rotation is where you grow crop A on this plot of land this year. Next year, you grow crop A on another plot of land. And in the third year, you grow crop A on a third plot of land. But every year, at least one part of your land lies untended. The idea was to put nutrients back into soil, nutrients and minerals to get back to soil. You might say, how would letting land sit put minerals back in the soil? Because land that's not tended to will start growing weeds. The weeds don't need all the vitamin, you might say the minerals and fertilizers that real plants do. But these weeds will contain, and when they die out in the wintertime, they'll put the minerals back in the soil. But they learned long ago to practice crop rotation. It took Europeans a long time to learn that, but eventually they did. The Chinese also, your book refers to this as natural fertilizers. There's another way of saying human waste, which actually is known to make for some of the very best fertilizer, but Westerners have never used it because it's human. Yeah, you might put it that way. Yes. To the Western mindset, it's gross. The Eastern Oriental peoples know that it's really, really good fertilizer. But you're right, it does seem gross. All right. Now, before we get into Chinese history proper, I must mention the Silk Road. The Silk Road joined China to the Mediterranean world. In other words, now the Silk Road took various routes. Sometimes it went pretty far south in India. Sometimes it dipped deep into Arabia. The routes changed depending on the political situation You know, if a strong ruler was in a certain area, they'd run the route through his area. If the ruler was weak and couldn't keep down outlaw bands, they'd bypass his area. Now, to make clear, no Chinaman that we know of ever got to the Mediterranean world, and no Mediterranean man ever went to China until the time of Marco Polo. Surely some of them did, but we can't name them, but the goods did. The Chinese would send their goods here, and if one merchant would send his goods a few hundred miles and sell it to another merchant. He'd carry the goods a few hundred more miles and sell it to another. And eventually the goods got all the way to the Mediterranean world, and then the Mediterranean world shipped their gold and silver to China. Keep that in mind, folk, because that's how Europe lost its gold for a long time. The gold and silver went to China, and if you go to China today, any Chinese person will tell you Roman gold coins are still in circulation in China, because the gold and silver found its way into India and China and never found its way back. It's called an unfavorable balance of trade, whether you buy more than you sell. And the United States is doing the same thing. Has been doing it for many, many years. Unfavorable balance of trade. All right, Silk Road, must mention it because it will be mentioned later on. All right. Now, the Chinese history proper begins, as is the case of the history of all peoples, begins with stories that we call fairy tales, or mythologies, or legends. Call them what you will. Stories that we think are fantastic, the long ago and far away type, except for these stories happen right to the Chinese person, happen right there in China. But they do not have, as you might say, as far out a fairy tale as other people's, but they do feature a lot of stories about these creatures. And if you go to a Chinese restaurant today, and yes, I do like Chinese food, if they give you as their zodiac on a napkin or on a paper in front of you, one of their signs of zodiac, yeah, they have 12 zodiac signs, and one of the 12 signs is the dragon. Anybody know what month it is, the dragon? Oh, no, it's not months, it's years. It's years, yeah, it's not a matter of months, it's years.
2012 was the year of the dragon.
2012 was the year of the dragon, thank you. That means about 2024 will be the next year of the dragon, somewhere around there. Anyway, they have a year for the rabbit, a year for the snake, a year for the rooster, whatever. Anyway, now, folk, I want to remind you, every society that we know of has dragon stories. And when you actually look at the drawings, or read the descriptions of the dragons, their drawings look remarkably like our dinosaur bones. We put our dinosaur bones together. Yes, remarkably. Now, I want to officially, the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago, and humans have only been around for about 240,000 years. So humans and dinosaurs never came into contact with each other. That's what I'm supposed to say officially. That's the standard view. But if you don't notice this already, I am not saying. So I don't mind telling you that either. No, we find dinosaur tissues now, soft tissue with dinosaur blood veins that have hemoglobin inside. And folk, somebody try to explain to me how soft tissue can last on an animal for 65 million years. Quite frankly, I don't know. And there are rumors that dragon-like creatures are being found in the Congo, in Africa, in areas where it's very difficult to get to. I had two students, husband and wife team, sat in the front row, and they didn't believe it. But the husband did a research paper, and he gave me the papers with his sources. And if you look at the right web pages, or look at the right YouTube videos, there are references made to encounters of humans with dinosaurs. And when the African people who live there try to draw the dinosaur, the dragons, they look a lot like. We can actually give the genus and species name of the dragons that are there. In other words, indicating that they're still around. If you study literature, you'll run into Beowulf, who killed a dragon by breaking its arm. And you broke a dragon's arm, the dragon bled to death. Like you break a horse's leg, nothing you can do with a horse after that but shoot it. They now have a few broken legs that you can fix, but for the most part, the horse goes into convulsions. Also, he cannot walk. Unlike a cat or a dog who can walk on 3 legs, horses cannot. All right. Anyway, dragons are a big part of their literature. But their history starts with a little bit of folklore. Start with 3 sovereigns. These 3 sovereigns are credited with giving China their gift of civilization, teaching the Chinese such things as farming, not only plants but with cattle farming, sheep farming, goat farming, farming with animals that can be tamed. There are some animals that you can tame and some that you can't. But also the sovereigns taught them how to set up courts, how to set up governments, that they should obey their rulers. If you don't, there'll be chaos. Again, we do not know if these 3 sovereigns actually existed or not, because all we have record of is secondary sources. Someday we might find a palace, and the same thing